Hey guys, tonight we begin with stone. Cold stone. Damp stone. Stone that has seen more awkward royal dinners than you've had hot meals. So go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe pull the blanket up a little higher. Let your phone rest gently beside you. We are not here for excitement. We are not here for dramatic battle music. We are here to wander slowly through castle rooms, echoing halls, and drafty corridors where history's most complicated families tried, often unsuccessfully, to look majestic. Take a slow breath. Tonight, we drift into the world of European castles. The towering fortresses that look romantic on postcards, but were, in reality, freezing stone boxes filled with anxious monarchs, questionable genetics, and the faint smell of wet wool. Because nothing says divine right to rule like mildew. Let's start with the castle itself. Before we even meet our royals, we need to understand their home. Medieval castles were not cozy. They were not softly lit by aesthetic candles. They were fortifications first, residences second, and comfortable living spaces, never. Walls were thick. Sometimes 12 feet thick. Which sounds reassuring. Until you realize thick walls mean very small windows. And small windows mean very little light. So imagine being a royal child, raised in semi-darkness, wrapped in layers of heavy fabric, while your tutor drones on in Latin. It was less fairy tale princess and more Gothic cave internship. And of course, heating. Or rather, the idea of heating. Most castles had fireplaces. Large ones. Grand ones. But stone absorbs cold like it's personally offended by warmth. Even with roaring fires, rooms stayed chilly. Bedrooms were hung with tapestries not just for decoration, but to trap heat. So when you picture a medieval king lounging comfortably, imagine him instead wrapped in fur, wearing 3 layers, and still complaining about drafts. Which, to be fair, he absolutely did. Let's gently step into one of these halls. Long wooden tables. Flickering torchlight. Servants moving quietly. A king at the head, trying to appear powerful while subtly adjusting his cloak because a gust of wind just snuck under the door. And now, into these rooms, we introduce our first royal resident of cold stone discomfort. Henry VI of England. Henry was born in 1421. He became king before he could walk. Because of course he did. Royal babies rarely get to crawl in peace. His father, Henry V, died when little Henry was only 9 months old. So England looked at this infant and collectively said, yes. That one. He's in charge now. A bold choice. He grew up inside Windsor Castle and other royal residences. Surrounded by towering stone walls. And expectations. So many expectations. Henry VI was supposed to be a warrior king like his father. He was not. Henry was gentle. Quiet. Deeply religious. He preferred prayer to politics. Which is admirable. But perhaps not ideal when you're managing the 100 Years' War. Inside those castle halls, advisors whispered. Nobles schemed. Meanwhile, Henry spent hours in contemplation. The echoing corridors of his castles must have felt less like seats of power and more like oversized monasteries. And then there were his episodes. Henry suffered from severe mental health crises. Long periods where he became unresponsive, silent, detached. For over a year at one point, he barely reacted to anything. His son was born during one of these episodes. Henry reportedly did not respond when told he had an heir. Now imagine the castle atmosphere during that time. Stone corridors. Whispering courtiers. A silent king staring into nothing. Not exactly comforting bedtime vibes for the monarchy. And of course, when a king falters, everyone else sharpens their ambitions. The wars of the roses simmered. Rival houses circled. All within these grand halls built to project stability. Cold stone walls cannot fix a fragile dynasty. Let's float gently away from England and drift south, toward Spain. To another castle. Another royal line. And perhaps the most infamous example of dynastic dedication. We meet Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles was born in 1661. A proud Habsburg. And if you know the Habsburgs, you already feel the tension building. Because the Habsburg family tree did not branch. It looped. Uncles married nieces. Cousins married cousins. Over and over again. Because maintaining pure blood was apparently more important than introducing fresh DNA. And Charles II was the result. He lived in the vast Spanish palaces, El Escorial especially. A massive stone complex. Grand. Severe. Imposing. It looks less like a home and more like a very ambitious monastery that learned about monarchy halfway through construction. Charles was physically frail. His jaw, famously known as the Habsburg jaw, protruded dramatically. He struggled to chew. To speak clearly. He was often ill. He did not walk until he was 8. Because again, genetics decided to experiment. The rooms of El Escorial were vast and austere. High ceilings. Long corridors. Religious artwork everywhere. Charles grew up in a world of ritual and rigidity. He was surrounded by caretakers, priests, physicians, all trying to manage a body and mind that had been handed a difficult start. He was described as kind, gentle, lonely. He married twice. Neither marriage produced children. Which, considering his genetic inheritance, may have been nature quietly intervening. Inside those echoing Spanish halls, Charles performed the rituals of kingship. Audiences. Ceremonies. All while physically deteriorating. The castle stood solid. Impressive. Eternal. The king inside it did not. When Charles died in 1700, it triggered the War of the Spanish Succession. Because when you don't produce an heir, Europe collectively panics. All of that drama, born from years of cousin marriage decisions made in similarly drafty rooms. Let's drift now to France. Because no one did royal architecture quite like the French. Versailles. Ah yes. The palace that said, what if we took stone, and added mirrors? Louis XIV built Versailles as a statement. a glittering monument to absolute monarchy. And perhaps to distract everyone from how unstable politics could be. Versailles was enormous. Lavish. Gold everywhere. But beneath the glamour, it was still a rigid machine designed to control the nobility. Courtiers lived there. Hundreds of them. All competing for proximity to the king. Imagine living in a palace where your greatest ambition is to hand someone their shirt. Louis XIV's daily routine was public. Waking up. Getting dressed. Eating. All observed. The king turned personal privacy into political theater. Which sounds glamorous. Until you realize it meant constant scrutiny. Constant performance. The palace corridors buzzed with gossip. Alliances. Rivalries. All under crystal chandeliers. And then we come to Louis XV. He inherited Versailles as a child. Became king at 5. Because apparently Europe enjoys putting toddlers in charge. Louis XV grew up in opulence. But also isolation. The palace that sparkled so brightly was also deeply controlled. His education was structured. His interactions monitored. As an adult, he developed a reputation for, let's say, romantic enthusiasm. He had numerous mistresses. Official ones. Semi-official ones. Possibly a small rotating cast. Versailles had secret staircases. Hidden apartments. Because when you build a palace that large, discretion becomes architectural. But beneath the indulgence was a king increasingly disconnected from his people. The palace insulated him. Protected him from criticism. Which, historically speaking, does not end well. Stone walls. Gold ceilings. Emotional distance. It's a recurring theme. Now, let's gently wander east. To Russia. Where the winters were colder. And so were the palaces. The Romanovs. Peter the Great built St. Petersburg as his window to the west. And with it came grand palaces like the Winter Palace. Vast. Icy blue. Facing the Neva River. It looked magnificent. It was also freezing. Russian winters are not symbolic. They are aggressive. Even with fireplaces, drafts slipped through. Ice formed along windows. Royal residents layered up and tried to appear unbothered. Let's focus on Peter III for a moment. Peter III was born in 1728. Raised in Germany. He adored Prussia. He admired Frederick the Great to an almost fanboy degree. Which was awkward when you're ruling Russia and expected to dislike Prussia. Inside the Winter Palace, Peter played with toy soldiers. As an adult, he preferred military drills to governance. His wife, Catherine, watched carefully. Catherine the Great. She was intelligent. Ambitious. Patient. While Peter alienated nobles with his odd behavior and policy decisions, Catherine built alliances. The palace corridors hummed again with whispers. And then, in 1762, Peter was overthrown. Catherine took power. Peter died shortly after under mysterious circumstances. which is a polite historical way of saying, things got complicated. Catherine ruled from those same grand halls. She expanded the empire, hosted intellectual salons, collected art. The palace that had housed a distracted, toy soldier-loving emperor now hosted one of Russia's most formidable rulers. Same stone, different temperament. And through all of this, the walls remained indifferent. Let's slow our pace even more. Because castles and palaces were not just stages for kings. They were nurseries for royal children. Children who often did not experience childhood in the way we imagine. Take the example of Marie Antoinette. She arrived in France at 14. Transported from Austria to Versailles to marry the future Louis XVI. She left her dog behind. She underwent a ceremonial handover at the border, where she was stripped of Austrian possessions and dressed entirely in French garments. A symbolic transformation. She entered Versailles, a glittering labyrinth of etiquette. Every movement scrutinized. Every outfit judged. She was young. She was isolated. She made mistakes. The palace amplified everything. Her spending. Her friendships. Her attempts at privacy in the Petit Trianon. Versailles had become a golden cage. And outside its gates, resentment grew. But for now, we stay inside. We walk quietly through candlelit corridors. Past portraits of ancestors with identical jaws. Through halls that echo with footsteps and soft gossip. These castles were meant to project permanence. Stability. Divine order. But inside them lived very human people. Sickly heirs. Lonely queens. Kings overwhelmed by expectations. Stone cannot warm insecurity. Gold cannot cure genetic repetition. And long corridors cannot prevent emotional meltdowns. As we settle deeper into this slow drift through history, notice how similar these spaces feel. England's damp keeps. Spain's austere monasteries. France's gilded galleries. Russia's icy expanses. Different styles. Same themes. Power wrapped in isolation. Grandeur hiding fragility. And always, the stone. Cold. Patient. Observing. Take another slow breath. Because in part 2, we'll wander further into the private chambers. Into the bedrooms, nurseries, and long dining halls where dynastic decisions were made, sometimes wisely, often not. For now, let the image settle. A vast medieval hall. A single fire burning low. Tapestries swaying slightly in a draft no one has ever fully fixed. And somewhere in the distance, a royal sigh. Hey guys, tonight we begin with dinner. Not your dinner. Not the leftover pasta quietly waiting in your fridge. I mean medieval royal dinner. The kind eaten in echoing stone halls under the watchful gaze of ancestors who all share the same slightly concerning chin. So go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket. Let your shoulders relax. We're not storming castles tonight. We're wandering slowly through them. Specifically toward the kitchen. Which, ironically, was often the warmest and most functional part of the entire place. Because while castles were drafty monuments to power, kitchens were where things actually worked. Let's imagine the scene. A long hall. Stone walls. Torches flickering. A table stretching nearly the length of a bowling lane. At the far end sits the king. Elevated, of course. Because digestion is more efficient when you're symbolically superior. Before we even talk about feasts, let's talk about daily meals. Because contrary to what Renaissance paintings suggest, medieval kings did not eat roasted swans every afternoon. Well, not every afternoon. Most royal households followed a structured meal schedule. There was dinner, which confusingly was eaten around late morning. And supper, served in the early evening. Breakfast was barely a thing for adults. Children and the elderly might nibble early, but serious grown monarchs did not snack casually. That would imply weakness. So imagine Henry VIII. Massive. Layered in velvet. Waiting until 10 or 11 a.m. to begin the serious business of overeating. Henry VIII is a natural place to start, because when it comes to royal meals, he is the human equivalent of a banquet. In his younger years, Henry was athletic. He jousted. He hunted. He danced. He could probably justify consuming half a forest animal before noon. His court kitchens at Hampton Court Palace were enormous. They employed hundreds of staff. Entire rooms dedicated to pastry. To boiling. To roasting. There were separate fireplaces large enough to walk inside. Which feels excessive. But then again, so was Henry. Records show that in a single day, the royal kitchens might prepare dozens of dishes. Beef. Mutton. Swan. Peacock. Pies filled with spiced meats and fruits. And sugar. So much sugar. Sugar was a luxury. Imported. Expensive. So naturally, it became a symbol of status. The wealthier you were, the sweeter your food. Teeth. Not really considered. Henry's later portraits show a man who clearly embraced this culinary philosophy. After a jousting accident in 1536 left him with a leg injury, his physical activity declined. His appetite did not. And so the feasts continued. He consumed around 5,000 calories a day. Sometimes more. Ale. Wine. Meat at nearly every meal. Vegetables did exist. But they were often seen as peasant food. Royal digestion was apparently above cabbage. As Henry aged, he grew heavier. Less mobile. His leg ulcer worsened. Courtiers tiptoed around his moods. And yet, the banquets rolled on. Because to reduce the feast would suggest decline. And Tudor kings did not decline. They expanded. Sometimes horizontally. Now let's drift south. Toward Italy. Where Renaissance courts approached food with elegance, and just a hint of poisoned paranoia. The Medici family of Florence were bankers turned unofficial rulers. They understood spectacle. And spectacle included banquets that doubled as political messaging. Enter Catherine de Medici. She married into the French royal family and eventually became queen consort of Henry II of France. Catherine brought Italian culinary flair with her. Forks, for example, became more common in France partly due to Italian influence. Before that, people often used knives and fingers. Imagine trying to maintain royal dignity while grabbing greasy meat with your hands. Catherine thought, perhaps, we can do better. She introduced more refined dishes. Sauces. Pastries. Decorative presentation. Meals became theatrical. Sugar sculptures shaped like mythological creatures. Because if you're going to eat dessert, it might as well resemble a Roman god. But court meals were not just about taste. They were about hierarchy. Where you sat mattered deeply. Proximity to the monarch meant favor. Being seated far down the table meant, start networking. Versailles perfected this system later. But even earlier courts treated dining as structured performance. Nobles observed the king eating. Sometimes they simply watched. Yes. Watched. Louis XIV turned his daily meals into semi-public events. The Grand Couvert allowed courtiers to observe him dine. He would eat multiple courses while nobles stood nearby, hoping to catch his attention. It's unclear whether this made digestion easier. But it certainly reinforced the idea that even chewing could be political. Louis XIV had a healthy appetite. He enjoyed rich stews, game meats, elaborate desserts. And yet he maintained a relatively controlled physique compared to some of his relatives. Moderation, for him, meant not devouring the entire boar personally. But let's float over to another royal digestive adventure. Charles II of Spain. Our dear Habsburg with the famously dramatic jaw. Because of his pronounced mandibular prognathism, chewing was difficult. Painful, even. His meals had to be prepared carefully. Softened. Cut small. He often struggled to swallow. Imagine being the most powerful man in Spain, and needing your meat minced like a toddler's. And yet the court insisted on maintaining grandeur. Multi-course meals continued. Rituals persisted. Even as the king himself could barely manage a few bites. The contrast is almost poetic. A massive palace. Endless food. A king who cannot properly chew. Sometimes dynastic ambition writes jokes that historians don't need to embellish. Now let's travel to England again. But this time to a quieter, more restrained table. Enter Queen Anne. And ruled from 1702 to 1714. She suffered from numerous health issues. Gout. Obesity. Multiple miscarriages. Of her 17 pregnancies, none of her children survived into adulthood. Food, for Anne, was both comfort and complication. She enjoyed hearty English fare. Meats. Puddings. Sweet wines. But gout made movement painful. Her weight increased. Her health declined. Court dinners became physically taxing. Imagine climbing into a heavy gown. Sitting upright for hours. Smiling politely while your joints ache. Royal meals were not casual affairs. They were endurance tests in lace and velvet. Let's soften the candlelight a bit and drift north again. To Russia. Because Russian banquets deserve their own slow, snowy paragraph. Peter the Great enjoyed hearty food. But he also enjoyed shocking his guests. He hosted gatherings that blurred lines between formal banquet and chaotic social experiment. There was drinking. A lot of drinking. Toasts. Forced participation. Peter believed in breaking old traditions, including aristocratic stiffness. Meals under Peter could feel unpredictable. He wanted modernization, westernization, and apparently enthusiastic alcohol consumption. Later Romanovs refined the spectacle. Catherine the Great preferred structured elegance. French chefs were imported. Courses were choreographed. Yet even in the Winter Palace, meals could be cold. Literally. Drafts seeped through windows. Dishes cooled quickly in winter air. Imagine eating delicate French cuisine while your breath is faintly visible. Now let's wander back to medieval childhood. Because royal children had very particular diets. Young heirs were often fed rich foods early. Meat broths. White bread. Sweet treats when available. The idea was nourishment for strength. But combined with limited medical knowledge, this sometimes led to digestive troubles. Take Edward VI of England. Son of Henry VIII. Sickly from childhood. Carefully monitored diet. Physicians recommended various regimens. Adjustments. Restrictions. But underlying illnesses were not easily solved by changing supper. Royal nurseries were quieter than banquet halls. Smaller tables. Nursemaids supervising. Tiny silver cups. And hovering always in the background was expectation. This child must survive. Must grow. Must continue the line. Meals became acts of hope. Sometimes desperate hope. Let's gently shift to the Ottoman Empire for a moment. Topkapi Palace in Istanbul housed sultans with elaborate culinary systems. The palace kitchens were massive. Thousands of staff. Separate kitchens for different ranks within the harem. The sultan's meals were carefully guarded. Tasters sampled dishes for poison. Because when you rule an empire, dinner can become strategic. Yet even here, food reflected hierarchy. Ingredients were allocated based on status. Access to spices signaled favor. Sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent enjoyed refined cuisine. Rice dishes. Lamb. Honeyed desserts. But the kitchens were so vast that feeding the palace daily required military-level organization. Stone walls. Endless corridors. And somewhere deep inside, pots simmering continuously. As we continue drifting, notice how food reveals personality. Henry VIII devoured extravagantly. Louis XIV ritualized every bite. Charles II struggled quietly with each chew. And sought comfort amid pain. Peter turned dinner into unpredictable theater. Behind every feast was a human body. Limited. Vulnerable. Often overindulged. And the castle walls absorbed it all. The smells of roasting meat. The echo of clinking goblets. The sighs of overfed nobles adjusting their belts discreetly. Even fasting had its place. Medieval religious calendars dictated meatless days. Fish substituted for flesh. Because spiritual discipline occasionally interrupted royal appetite. Though creative cooks found ways to make fish remarkably indulgent. Because if you cannot eat beef, you might as well butter the cod beyond recognition. Now imagine the end of a feast. Candles burned low. Plates scraped clean. Dogs roaming under tables for scraps. Servants clearing trenchers. Nobles drifting away in clusters, whispering about alliances. And at the high table, the monarch rising slowly. Perhaps satisfied. Perhaps uncomfortable. Perhaps already planning tomorrow's display. Food was sustenance. But more than that, it was performance. To eat lavishly meant power. To host extravagantly meant stability. Even when stability was quietly crumbling. As you settle further into this slow wandering, picture one last medieval kitchen before we pause. Huge hearths glowing red. Spits turning steadily. Cooks sweating despite winter cold. Outside, stone towers loom. Inside, pots bubble. Because no matter how fragile the dynasty, dinner still had to be served. Take a slow breath. Hey guys, tonight we begin quietly. Not in the throne room. Not at the banquet table. But just outside the door. In the corridor. Where the servants are already awake, and the guards are trying very hard not to look bored. So dim the lights. Let your screen glow softly. Get comfortable. Maybe shift your pillow just slightly to the left. Tonight, we're drifting through the invisible world inside castles and palaces. The world beneath the crowns. The quiet army of people who made royalty possible, and occasionally survivable. Because for every king dramatically sighing near a window, there were about 3 servants holding that window open. Let's begin with the structure. Castles were not just homes. They were ecosystems. Highly organized ones. There was a clear chain of command. At the top, the monarch. Below them, nobles. Below them, officials. And below them, everyone who actually did the work. Servants were divided by rank. Very carefully. A senior steward would oversee finances and supplies. Chamberlains managed private rooms. Ladies-in-waiting attended queens. Valets dressed kings. Grooms handled horses. Scullery maids scrubbed pots large enough to hide existential dread inside. And everyone knew their place. Hierarchy was the true architecture of the castle. Stone walls just supported it. Let's imagine an early morning at Versailles. The sun is barely up. The palace is still quiet. But the servants are already moving. Cleaning corridors. Preparing clothes. Polishing silver. Because soon, the king will wake. Louis XIV perfected this ritual. His morning routine was called the lever. It was not just waking up. It was a performance. Different nobles were admitted in stages to watch him rise from bed. and the servants orchestrated the entire event. First, a select group would enter. High-ranking courtiers. Then others, depending on favor. And throughout it all, valets moved precisely. Presenting garments. Adjusting wigs. Handing over stockings like sacred objects. Imagine your morning routine requiring 20 witnesses and a small production team. And yet, for the servants, this was normal. They operated with silent efficiency. They knew which noble outranked which. Who could stand closer? Who must wait outside? Hierarchy was oxygen. Now let's drift to England. To Hampton Court Palace under Henry VIII. Henry had a massive household. Over 1,000 people at times. Yes. 1,000. The royal court was less family and more small city with gossip. At the heart of this system was the Lord Steward. He managed the king's household. Beneath him, layers of officials. Clerks. Ushers. Yeomen of the guard. And then the lower servants. The groom of the stool, for example. Now, this title deserves a slow pause. The groom of the stool was responsible for assisting the king in the bathroom. Yes. That bathroom. But here's the twist. This was actually a prestigious position. Because access meant intimacy. And intimacy meant influence. Imagine advising the king while holding, let's say, royal paperwork of a different kind. Power comes in unusual forms. The yeomen of the guard stood watch. Dressed in distinctive uniforms. Armed. Alert. Their job was protection. And symbolism. They were visible reminders that the monarch was important enough to require guarding at all times. But even guards had hierarchy. Senior officers commanded respect. Lower-ranked guards stood longer shifts. And all of them existed to maintain an image of control. Let's float over to Spain. To the Habsburg court. The Spanish royal household was famously rigid. Formality governed everything. Servants moved quietly. Eyes lowered. Protocol strictly observed. Philip II of Spain preferred solitude. He worked from El Escorial, a palace monastery hybrid that felt spiritually intense even by 16th-century standards. His servants operated in near silence. Philip valued order. Discipline. Privacy. He rarely laughed. He rarely displayed emotion publicly. And so the staff adjusted. Conversations were hushed. Footsteps softened. The palace felt less like a bustling home and more like a very organized library, where everyone was slightly anxious. Now imagine being a young page. Pages were usually boys from noble families. Sent to serve and learn court etiquette. They ran errands. Delivered messages. Observed everything. It was training. Exposure to power. Also exposure to political tension. One wrong word. One misplaced document. And suddenly you're remembered for the wrong reason. Let's gently shift north again. To Russia's Winter Palace. The Romanov court was vast. Complex. Full of ceremonial detail. Under Catherine the Great, the palace staff included hundreds of servants, French chefs, German tutors, Russian guards. The diversity reflected Catherine's ambitions. The palace guards were elite, tall, impressive, carefully selected. But beneath them were ordinary soldiers assigned long hours in freezing corridors. And inside the palace, chambermaids attended to Catherine's personal quarters. Catherine valued intelligence. She corresponded with philosophers, hosted salons. And yet, even she relied heavily on her household staff. They prepared her writing desk, organized her letters, maintained her private apartments. Without them, enlightenment would have been considerably less tidy. Now let's slow down and consider the emotional lives of servants. Because while monarchs dealt with dynastic pressure, servants lived in proximity to it. They saw everything. The queen crying quietly after another failed pregnancy. The king pacing before a council meeting. The heir throwing a tantrum in silk stockings. Servants were witnesses. But they were expected to remain invisible. Silence was survival. In Tudor England, rumors could be dangerous. If a servant repeated private conversation outside the proper circle, consequences followed. Dismissal. Worse. So they learned to observe without reacting. To hear without commenting. To exist within strict boundaries. Let's drift toward France again. But this time, not to Louis XIV. Let's visit Marie Antoinette. By the late 18th century, Versailles was a machine of etiquette. Even the Queen's dressing routine involved layers of servants ranked by importance. The highest-ranking lady present had the honor of handing her the first garment. If someone of higher rank entered the room mid-dressing, the garment would be passed upward. Imagine pausing mid-blouse because someone outranks the current blouse holder. This was daily life. Servants navigated these delicate rituals carefully. One misstep could be interpreted as disrespect. And yet, many servants formed genuine attachments to their royal employers. Loyalty was complex. It could be sincere. It could be strategic. Sometimes both. Let's gently wander to the Ottoman Empire again. Topkapi Palace had its own intricate hierarchy. The inner palace staff were highly trained. The janissaries served as elite guards. Eunuchs oversaw sections of the harem. The chief black eunuch held immense influence. He controlled access to the Sultan's family quarters. Power, once again, lived in proximity. Guards maintained strict control of palace entrances. Servants worked within tightly structured roles. And through it all, silence. Always silence. Because hierarchy depends on predictability. Now picture a nighttime corridor. Torches dimmed. A single guard standing watch. A servant hurrying past with lowered eyes. Somewhere behind the heavy wooden door, a monarch lies awake. Worrying about succession. About alliances. About reputation. The guard does not comment. The servant does not ask questions. The castle continues breathing quietly. Let's float over to another royal household. This time, the Habsburgs of Austria. Empress Maria Theresa ruled in the 18th century. She had 16 children. Yes. 16. Her household was enormous. Governesses supervised children. Tutors educated them. Nurses monitored health. Valets attended her husband, Francis I. Maria Theresa was deeply involved in her children's lives. She wrote long letters. Gave advice. Sometimes very direct advice. Servants facilitated these connections. Delivered letters. Arranged meetings. The palace functioned because thousands of small tasks were completed daily. Beds made. Clothes mended. Floors swept. Hierarchy kept it all moving. But what happened when hierarchy faltered? When a servant overstepped? Or when a guard chose the wrong side in a succession dispute? Let's not dive into drama. We'll keep it gentle. Suffice it to say, loyalty mattered. And in many cases, servants survived by adapting quickly to new rulers. When dynasties shifted, uniforms changed. Titles updated. But the work remained. There were always rooms to clean. Doors to guard. Secrets to keep. As we drift slowly toward the end of this first stretch, notice how consistent this pattern is. Monarchs appear singular. Powerful. Central. But behind every royal sigh stood a network of individuals making sure the sigh happened on schedule. Servants dressed kings who could barely button their own cuffs. Guards protected rulers who sometimes made questionable decisions. Hierarchy maintained illusion. Stone walls amplified it. And in the quiet spaces between ceremonies, it was the invisible people who kept the palace running. Take a slow breath. Picture a grand staircase. At the top, a king descending slowly. At the bottom, servants aligned perfectly. Still. Silent. Essential. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a quiet room. Not the throne room. Not the ballroom glittering with chandeliers and ambition. Just a private chamber. Heavy curtains drawn. A single candle flickering. A crown resting somewhere nearby, slightly crooked, because even symbols of divine authority get tired. So dim the lights. Let your breathing slow down. Settle into the pillow like you've just inherited a small but emotionally complicated kingdom. Tonight, we're talking about loneliness. The particular kind that comes wrapped in velvet and responsibility. The kind that echoes in long corridors long after the courtiers have gone home. Because royal power looks magnificent from a distance. Up close, it often feels like a very ornate isolation chamber. Let's begin in Spain. Philip II. He ruled in the 16th century and controlled a vast empire. Spain. Parts of Italy. The Netherlands. Territories across the ocean. On paper, he was one of the most powerful men in the world. In practice, he spent most of his time alone in a study. Philip moved his court to El Escorial, a massive granite complex outside Madrid. It was part palace, part monastery, part royal statement piece. Severe. Symmetrical. Almost aggressively quiet. Philip preferred paperwork to parties. He read documents personally, annotated them, micromanaged details. He believed ruling was a solitary responsibility. Which it was. But he took it to heart. He married 4 times. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, died young. His second, Mary I of England, ruled in her own right, but the marriage produced no children. His third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, was much younger and reportedly brought some warmth into his life. She died too. His fourth marriage secured an heir, but not necessarily companionship. Philip lost children, lost wives, watched his empire stretch thin. Inside El Escorial's stone corridors, he moved quietly. He dressed in black. He prayed. He wrote letters. So many letters. Power did not prevent solitude. It may have amplified it. Now let's float gently to England. Queen Elizabeth I. She was called the Virgin Queen. Which sounds romantic. Almost mythic. In reality, it was strategic branding layered over personal caution. Elizabeth watched her mother executed. Watched her father marry repeatedly. Watched political alliances collapse around marriage decisions. So she chose not to marry. Or perhaps she chose not to risk it. As queen, she maintained flirtations. She entertained suitors. Robert Dudley remained close for years. But she never relinquished authority through marriage. And that choice meant something. She ruled alone. Advisors surrounded her. Courtiers adored her. But ultimate decisions rested on her shoulders. Imagine walking through Richmond Palace at night, hearing only your own footsteps, knowing that any sign of weakness would be scrutinized. Elizabeth projected confidence, wit, intelligence. But personal letters reveal anxiety, doubt, moments of emotional fatigue. She once said, "I see all the birds are flown." It was a quiet reflection late in life. Many of her closest companions had died. Time moved forward. And she remained. A queen. And alone. Let's drift toward France. Louis XVI. He inherited Versailles at 19. A palace designed for spectacle. Endless rooms. Endless eyes. Louis was shy. Reserved. More interested in locksmithing than ruling. Yes. Locksmithing. While courtiers schemed in mirrored halls, Louis tinkered with locks. It's almost charming. The most powerful man in France, quietly focused on hinges. His marriage to Marie Antoinette was distant at first. Awkward. Unconsummated for several years. Which, for a royal couple expected to produce heirs immediately, created pressure. Louis was not naturally charismatic. He struggled with decisiveness. He avoided confrontation. Versailles magnified this. The palace demanded performance. Confidence. Display. Louis preferred simplicity. As political tensions grew, he retreated further inward. Emotionally. Physically. Even surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, he often seemed isolated. Because authority does not equal connection. Now let's gently move east. Peter II of Russia. He became emperor at 11. 11. Imagine being handed an empire when you still misplace your gloves. Peter II lost both parents young. Raised within the rigid structure of the Russian court, he found companionship in a small circle of favorites. He avoided formal responsibilities when possible. Preferred hunting, riding, youthful distractions. But the court was a serious place. Political factions maneuvered around him. He died at 14. A brief reign. A brief life. And likely very little time spent feeling genuinely secure. Let's soften our pace further. Marie Antoinette again. Because beyond the diamonds and rumors, there was a young woman transported to a foreign country at 14. She left Austria. Left her mother. Arrived at Versailles under immense scrutiny. Every gesture analyzed. Every purchase criticized. She sought comfort in a smaller circle. Built a private retreat at the Petit Trianon. A space where she could escape the rigid protocol. Critics saw extravagance. She likely saw a breathing room. Her letters to friends reveal vulnerability. Homesickness. Confusion about hostility. The palace that glittered so brightly also isolated her from public understanding. Loneliness can be loud. Even in a ballroom. Let's float now to Austria. Crown Prince Rudolf. Son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, c.c. Rudolf grew up under strict discipline. His education was rigorous. Military-focused. Emotionally cold. His mother, c.c., was distant. Preoccupied with her own melancholy and travels. Rudolf developed liberal political ideas. Clashed with conservative court expectations. He felt misunderstood. Constrained. Surrounded by formality. By expectation. His personal life was troubled. His marriage unhappy. And within the grand halls of the Habsburg court, he drifted into increasing isolation. Even princes can feel invisible. Let's gently wander toward Denmark. Christian VII. He ruled in the 18th century and struggled with severe mental health issues. He exhibited erratic behavior. Emotional instability. Periods of paranoia. His marriage to Caroline Matilda was strained. Court physicians intervened frequently. One of them, Johann Friedrich Struensee, gained influence. Became confidant and advisor. Christian drifted in and out of awareness. Power shifted around him. Imagine being king, and sensing decisions occur beyond your control. Loneliness here was not quiet. It was fragmented. The palace remained orderly. Ceremonies continued. But internally, Christian was adrift. Now let's slow the candlelight again. George III of Britain. Often remembered for losing the American colonies. But also for episodes of mental illness. He experienced periods of confusion. Agitation. Extended illness. During these times, his wife, Queen Charlotte, struggled to balance care and duty. Imagine being king and suddenly unable to trust your own thoughts. Imagine courtiers whispering, debating regency. George valued family. He and Charlotte had many children. Yet during illness, isolation crept in. Rooms once filled with conversation became controlled spaces of supervision. Loneliness layered over vulnerability. Let's drift toward Prussia. Frederick the Great. He was brilliant. Militarily successful. Intellectually sharp. He played the flute beautifully. But his childhood was harsh. His father was authoritarian. Emotionally severe. Frederick developed a guarded personality. He preferred philosophy. Corresponded with Voltaire. He did not enjoy traditional royal domestic life. He reportedly kept emotional distance. Possibly avoided intimacy. At Sanssouci Palace, he created a retreat. A place of art and music. The name means, without worry. Which feels slightly ironic for a king managing constant European tension. Even in artistic circles, Frederick remained cautious. Controlled. Self-contained. Power demands restraint. Restraint breeds distance. And distance can echo. Let's gently return to England one last time for tonight. Mary I. Often remembered harshly. But her life was marked by instability. Declared illegitimate after her father's break with Rome. Separated from her mother. Relegated in status. She regained the throne after political turmoil. But her marriage to Philip of Spain was distant. Politically motivated. She experienced phantom pregnancies. Public hope rising and falling painfully. Imagine the emotional weight of that. A queen. Awaiting an heir. The nation watching her body for signs. The disappointment repeated. Loneliness inside ceremony. As we settle into the quiet end of this first stretch, notice the pattern. Crowns amplify expectations. Palaces magnify distance. Servants surround. Advisors counsel. Crowds cheer. And yet, at night, in private chambers, many monarchs lay awake alone, thinking about heirs, about reputation, about mortality. Stone walls do not answer back. Take a slow breath. Picture a long corridor. Footsteps fading. A single door closing softly. Behind it, a ruler sitting by candlelight. Power resting heavily. Loneliness resting heavier.